it's a world full of data these days. It's easy to get overwhelmed. How do you decide which data points when you're doing these studies and reviews that really matter when it comes to understanding and influencing customer behavior or behavior in
I'm a
general? So not just customer behavior, but behavior in general.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of, and I have a physical whiteboard, but we do a lot of virtual whiteboards for obvious reasons. I'm a big proponent of lay everything on there and see where we start to collect critical mass and identify things that we did not expect. Because one of the best areas as we go down this rabbit hole is we say, oh, what does that mean? Because sometimes those are the nuggets you should be looking for, but your bias is saying, yeah, let's just, ancillary information. It's not important. So we kind of put everything together and start to literally Miro board where the commonalities are and group them, and then where are the most rare ones. And say, this is where the critical mass is building, but then these are just the weird things that we should at least reconcile, if not anything else. So that's how we go about it, is we kind of take all those theories, put them together, and then identify where our focus points are. That usually happens, our average research program is pretty long. It's about 6 months. That usually happens when we first get ancillary data, and then we do all those pulse checks throughout to make sure that we've validated it. Because to your point, you could go down so many of these, and eventually we will cover the vast majority of them that we think are viable, and we have a kind of a criteria check around should we go after something or not, or are we shooting from our emotional side instead, and sometimes that's okay, because actually the emotional ones sometimes tend to be gut reactions. And I have to tell people, I'm like, we're not actually trusting our gut. We're trusting the cells that live in our gut that are brain cells. So we should be listening to them a little bit. Because we've got brain cells in actually multiple parts of our body that according to research. So there's something there about when people say, oh, you're only trusting your gut. I'm like, sometimes there's some cells working there, so we've got to listen to them.
There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. But how often do you find that it's those, and look, I like the way you mentioned, where's the critical mass, where you've actually got enough data to look at, but how often is it those snippets of, well, that doesn't make sense, or this little thing doesn't quite look right. I wonder why that is. How often is it those things that you find come to be the major driving force?
The reason why we actually do that model and we split our resources that way is because I would say close to 50% of the time, those ancillary pieces are the actual, or not ancillary. They are actually part of a bigger picture that we're not seeing. So, I would say, if someone were to come in and say, well, how much percentage of things that were critical mass were actually, the things that helped you formulate the strategy in a complex and impactful way, and versus the ancillaries, I would say they're pretty well tied. And often, like I mentioned in the RTO program, we kept seeing just a couple random ones of like, I have to make multiple stops, or I have to go this weird direction or whatever. And I'm like, what? We went through the multiple stops route, and then as we went through the secondary round of asking people again what they mean by these things, we realized they were actually tied together. We just had only a part of the narrative of
Mhm.
the whole. So that actually is probably more common. Is It's not that one particular thing was a silver bullet. It was just we had to zoom out further to realize that we can collect those into a bigger bucket.
You're right. Interesting. Interesting. Look, research for me is one of the areas that I enjoy it, but I also find it, what's the way? I get bored easy. To looking at the same thing and digging down deeper and deeper. I tend to get bored easy, and I'm one of those people that, not necessarily through ego, or maybe it is ego, and I'm just denying that. That it's like, okay, I've seen enough. Let's move on. I have such a bias for action that I'll see what I think. Okay, and there you go. This, I'm going to refer back to it. It's gut feeling. Once you've got intuition says, yeah, okay, I've seen enough. Let's move forward in that direction. It's almost probably a little bit of that fail fast mentality where let's move on. If it doesn't work, then we can come back and go from there. But it's okay to do that when you're a smaller business and there's less at stake and you can move fleet, be very fleet of foot and move quickly from side to side, so to speak. But when you've got a large mid-size organisation, then you don't want to be making too many of those little mistakes along the way that can have big impact.
Exactly. And you can parse our 6-month one is probably the shortest one. We have the 12-month marker, which is our ideal, because those allow us to say preliminary information, go test it out in the field, and then we can continue to iterate while we're still running our double blind throughout it. And often, to your point, what happens is like, let's go fail fast and cheap on a couple things and move forward. And I think that I just read an article around how smaller size companies are actually going to be at a significant advantage in the next decade because of their ability to be nimble and move versus being a large ship that could potentially run into an iceberg and can't pivot fast enough. So there is something about just the method in which we also recommend. How often those companies take that is not as often as we would like. To say, hey, here's some preliminary information. Go test it in a very small market and then come back to us. We already have all your data, so we know the market that you're going to look into, so we can, we can take it with a grain of salt when the information comes back. But that kind of like ideally, if everyone follows the process on creating those, because I don't see research as a single point in time.
Mm-hmm.
When you're researching, you kind of have a layer of it across. When you take information, you apply it, you create a strategy around it, and then you put it in the market. You should consistently be researching your analytical phase of let me see what's going on. That's a research initiative, and we like to be there. We call them pulse checks after our perception program or what have you come in. If they don't want to, if a client doesn't want us to be there for the entire process, we'll just do a pulse check to say, let's just kind of, go to the doctor really quick and see how you're doing, get a quick physical around it to make sure you're headed in the right direction. And transparently, markets are changing so quickly that something that was true 8 months ago may not be true today. So, but you have enough of the foundation to know, how do you discern if it should be worried or not? And that's kind of the beauty of having that initial phase. And that's why we always start things in that research first model.
I guess the point that jumped to my mind while you were talking about that was where you'd done the research on why people weren't coming back or didn't want to come back into the office, what the reluctance was, and you said there's so many stops. Well, that was the first layer. And then you're able to dig down deeper and say, okay, well, tell us more about that. So what I was saying was that where you've got that layer of research that's ongoing, and then you're able to dig deeper. When the example you gave about people wanting to come back to the office and they're saying they've got too many stops, well, then you can dig down deeper, and that's where you got those insights about actually it's the childcare and child mining, drop-offs on the way through the issue. I get it. And I guess that's why organizations like yours exist, so that I don't have to sit there and try and do research for 6 months, which would drive me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that it takes a certain level of rigor for sure when you go into those modes. And but we chunk it out in ways that we white space some things as well. So sometimes it's like even just having that information and then letting your brain parse through it is important, because the back of your brain is starting to kind of figure things out. And if you've ever watched like a murder series or a true crime podcast, it's like they kind of pushed it aside, and then like 3 months later they came back to it, and then they had an aha moment. It's not that the aha moment was so obvious; it's that the back part of your brain was thinking about it for such a long time, and then it moved. And with the second time you reviewed it again, the front part of your brain kind of figured it out and caught up with it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And look, aside from rigor, there's a certain level of expertise to do market research properly, and that certainly is not my area of expertise.
Yeah, it's our team does a phenomenal job of just even removing the bias from that. And that's important in these.
I just wanted to jump back to this whole speed to lead in the CIA factor or intelligence using the fast responses and he who speaks first speaks best. How do you see that principle playing out in marketing, especially when it comes to capturing potential clients early?
I think that in marketing, a lot of our opportunity comes in at that middle of the funnel, and I'm not entirely sold on the funnel model because I don't think that's necessarily how we go into it, but it's an easy methodology that CMOs understand. Um, you've done the due diligence of getting them to build enough awareness of the organization.
Mm.
And now you're in the mode of, are you interested? Are you not? Where do you fall? What's your level of interest? And I think that you can use those to actually just cut from the clutter. And if you don't see, if you're working on a particular campaign that has brought in a set of leads that may not necessarily be marketing qualified, it's a great qualifying model to kind of say, hey, here's some information. Does this interest you? And I think actually a lot of marketing departments are worried about hearing no. And I actually think no is a great response because you can move them into nurture and you can host them there and continue to tell the narratives and stories that you need to tell to move them into a further point rather than having a polluted set of clients, potential clients that receive the same thing and then your conversion rates drop because of it.
Mhm.
I would much rather, and I'll speak for myself that focuses more on a relationship driven model. I would much rather someone say, hey, this is really interesting, but it's not something that we would have the budget for, I don't have the authority, any of the BANT elements for it, because it's such a incredible waste of time. And I think that is one of the few resources that cannot be replaced. And if you're down to a quarter or you're down to a quota for the year, you really want to talk to that. So that speed to lead around like getting the response and getting the answer around it. I think sale has some training mechanisms, from Sandler and some value selling and some of these other mechanisms
Mhm.
that train around like it's better to get the no. I think marketing needs the same lesson in many instances.
Yeah, I agree. And so that the speed of that response and getting those answers allows you to effectively, well, qualify, put those prospects or that prospects that wherever they might be in their buying process into the right stage of your funnel, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, and if you're getting too many no's, then maybe there's something in your messaging or the way that you've positioned the product or solution to say, well, we're getting a lot of no's, so I'd rather get the no and then inquire why right away if I start to see a pattern. But
Mm.
it kind of it put back accountability in the process, which is something I'm really big about. It kind of says they said no and why did they say no? And then if you start to see that pattern, then you say, well, hold on a minute. Does that mean we don't have the right buyer? If we're getting constantly, I'm not the right authority, because then that's an easy, those are pivots and those are pathways rather than kind of staying in the state of ambiguity that I think that middle of the funnel really has is, there's somewhere between interested and consideration. And in my opinion, if they're consideration and you're selling something that has a salesperson attached to it, there should be a salesperson assigned and actively having a conversation. If they're an
Yep.
interest, you want to get to a tier of interest. I go back to like my quadrants of 4, like, anything below anything below a 3 is nurture or investigate why. 3 and above, 4 obviously goes to a salesperson. 3 continues to like, offer them some high value. Because it gets you to that, it gets you to much more of a real estate of where pipeline is. And I think that as CMOs who are not necessarily tied to a number, it's a great way to build trust with your
Mm.
sales efforts.
Because ultimately the end objective is to build pipeline.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
And you're just transparent and honest about it, which I think is um, a great way to kind of support your sales team around it.
Right.
And uh, as someone who used to do that, you get a lot more ideas bought in when you can kind of say, hey, that didn't work. We're going to try this other thing. Do you guys want to try it? Oh, of course we would do.